Hello, welcome back to the Flip Side podcast. Today we're diving into one of the most complex and often polarizing debates in modern Britain, multiculturalism versus assimilation. Some people may ask, what else is there to talk about when it comes to this topic? On one hand, some people feel that this is a settled debate. Multiculturalism has definitely helped to create a more open and vibrant Britain, one that reflects the reality of how people live, love, and work today. Others are adamant that multiculturalism hasn't worked and it cannot work. Instead, it has led to fragmentation in society, parallel lives, and a weakening of national identity and cohesion. So it certainly isn't a settled debate, and that's why we're having this conversation today on the flip side. To explore this further, I'm joined by two guests with sharply contrasting views. We have Tariq Modood, a long-standing advocate for multiculturalism, who sees it not as a fragmentation, but as a path to inclusion. And we also have Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, who has challenged multiculturalism's assumptions and argues instead for a stronger civic framework, one that encourages integration without dividing people into cultural blocks. So the usual structure, I'll begin by giving each guest a couple of minutes to lay out their view, then we'll move on into some proper back and forth, and then I'll step in with some questions as well. Hope you enjoy the episode. So Alka and Tariq, we're glad to have you with us as we wade through these muddy waters of multiculturalism and assimilation. So Tariq, let's start with you. Could you just share a brief opening statement summarizing your thoughts on the topic?
Yes, thank you, Ada, for having me here, and Alka, thank you for our joint participation. So, some people are perceived and treated negatively, typically racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. They're stereotyped, they're disparaged, they're told they're not British. They and others fight back against it. What should be done? So, for me, and I would say for multiculturalism, the important concept is equal citizenship. So multiculturalists extend the classical idea of citizenship, which is basically everyone having the same rights, same treatment for everyone. And from that, of course, we derive the idea of anti-discrimination. That's the classical idea. Multiculturalists extend that to, for instance, challenging negative portrayals of stigmatized and marginalized racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. Extended further again to allowing groups to occupy the shared public space through positive images and identities of their own, whether it is by including Black history or Muslim dress in schools and workplaces or on, say, the BBC, extending that to inclusive programming on television, radio, the media. And the highest extent and level of multiculturalism is the rethinking of our country, of our national identity, as inclusive, as multi-ethnic and multi-religious. For example, to give you two imaginative examples, illustrations, I think the Olympics ceremony, the London Olympics opening ceremony in 2012 was a very good example of how British multiculturalism was celebrated, imagined and celebrated. I also think a different example, King Charles's coronation, was also in many ways an example of multiculturalism because it so clearly, obviously, an Anglican church service, and included lots of things that even Christians and Anglicans weren't aware of, quite a lot of archaic symbolism and aspects of the service, but, beautiful music and obviously in a beautiful setting, Westminster Abbey. But it had aspects of it reflecting contemporary multicultural Britain. For instance, there was a Black gospel choir, there was a Black woman bishop. At the end of the ceremony, King Charles was welcomed by three non-Christian community faith leaders who'd chosen not to participate in the service, but wanted to recognize the coronation, recognize the king, and he wanted to recognize them as representing a feature of multicultural Britain. So there was a Muslim, a Hindu, and a Jewish community leader. So we should be actively remaking our national identity. As for individual identities, people should be free to mix and match as suits them, and which may, of course, change over time and certainly across generations. No one should be pressured to give up an identity that is important to them. Black, Muslim, Hindu, and of course there are other identities beyond the scope of multiculturalism too, as long as those identities don't harm others. And no one should be pressured to assimilate. But nor should anyone be told that there's something wrong with them if they want to assimilate. And people will assimilate in different ways and to different extent, in different combinations. People will make their own decisions in their own way, and all should be encouraged and enabled to have a sense of belonging to our country, to being British. And I call what I've just described multicultural nationalism. Thanks.
That's amazing. Thank you for that comprehensive opener, Tariq. So, Alka, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, thank you, Ada, and thank you, Tariq. Pleasure to be invited to this. I think both multiculturalism and assimilation, I don't support either of them, because I think both presuppose quite fixed models of culture, where whether it's majority culture of the host country or the minority cultures of the incoming immigrants. I think integration is a better model because it encompasses a possibility of more open, creative engagement between both. It doesn't presuppose the assimilation, the majority has it all and the assimilation has nothing to offer, those who are to be assimilated, nor does it suppose that the minorities are somehow so vulnerable and need sort of super protecting. However, I think there are certain very important problems today, political and cultural problems, that make multiculturalism a much bigger problem for all people. And I think the clue to it is not so much in the multiculturalism, but in the culturalism. Because I think what's happened is that over decades, culture itself has become not just politicized, but has actually come to be a substitute for politics itself. It's become to be the preferred mode of elite governance through which the majority of the domestic population have themselves become disenfranchised. So unlike the period of social democracy, the post-war period, I think we no longer have a kind of majority of the demos who are integrated into a body politic and a civic body in which there's a kind of confidence that allows the kind of cultural give and take that, Tariq, you were illustrating, that my parents' generation, when they first came over, experienced. So I think that's kind of hugely problematic today. So I think in this situation, there are two new important developments that make multicultural principles a real danger to democracy. One is what I've just mentioned, the disintegration of the demos. I think the recent signs of populism that the mainstream intelligentsia and academic elites hate, I see more positively, not in toto, but as good signs of things that could be positive, even if they may not be there right yet. And I think also the really dangerous thing is that the state becomes a coercive mechanism par excellence of really negotiating and managing all our relationships. So it's like, so rather than standing as a citizen of Britain, whatever your ethnicity, subject to a universal law, for example, the Equality Act says, well, you're all equal. but you're equal if you approach the law as a member of a protected group. So the kind of incipient communalism is inbuilt into it, and that I think is and will increasingly do so exacerbate the kind of fragmentary, fractious tensions that we see already in British society.
Thank you for that, Alka. And now I'd just like to turn things over to each to ask 2 short questions to each other. So these can be 2 separate questions or 1 question with a follow-up question. And the idea really is to challenge, clarify, probe the effects into your opponent's points. So Tariq, if it's okay, let's go back to you. What would you like to ask Alka?
So I think of myself as a Democrat and someone who has a very strong sense of what we might call, and what in political theory we call, the common good. So I suspect that may connect with, overlap with, what you were referring to as the demos. I'm not sure, but, perhaps you could explain that. And on one particular point specifically, and that is, as I understand it, the demos is not a uniform body of what we might call abstract individualism, as in classical liberalism or classical citizenship. I see the demos as actually made up of people who aspire to a common identity, British national citizenship, but who have other identities that are important to them. And the common identity needs to accommodate the other identities rather than ignore them or marginalize them. So my question is, does your understanding of demos include this difference-sensitive understanding of the demos, or is it a difference-blind understanding of the demos?
Okay, thank you. I would say my answer to that would really depend upon what sphere you're talking about, because I think you talk about a national identity, which I think is very important. But for me, the problem is that I think minority ethnic identity has and continues to be weaponized in a way that is not just asking for accommodation, but is stigmatizing the majority the national identity. I think the idea of the nation has become, and I speak someone from the left, my whole political formation is from the left, and the question of the nation was always and remains very problematic for the left because they see it as exclusionary. And it is exclusionary on one sense. If you're British, then you're not French, then you're not, Indian or African, Nigerian. But what has been missed, and I think what needs to be refound and restated, is that that exclusion is a necessary basis for the democracy, because you're asking, with a representative democracy, you're giving your consent to political representatives to organize the major macro level arrangements in your society by which the goods are distributed, whether they're economic or cultural or whatever. Now, in return for your consent, they have to put your interests first. Now, that is then overlaid with other cultural and moral and ethical norms that Britain has been very good until of late, if you like, compared to other countries in accommodating. So, the kind of a sense of tolerance. And that has also been predicated on the different spheres of society. So when you ask me, is it just one kind of demos, one kind of interest? It's, there are different demands you would make of culture, politics, legal norms, academic norms. So I think we need more sensitivity to what we're asking in each sphere. Does that kind of answer what you're saying? To be honest, I forgot what your original question was.
I understand what you're saying anyway.
Okay.
Alka, do you have a question for Tariq?
Okay, yeah. I mean, in a way, it's a kind of follow-on from what we've just been talking about, which is when you say no one should be pressured to give up their identity. Now, I hear that as the often claimed, are you expecting me to give up my identity when I walk through the door of a job or in a, whatever situation? is it that wrong to ask somebody to not necessarily not give it up, but to put it on hold in preference for a temporary bigger identity? So, for example, when I was working before I kind of semi-retired, when I walked into school, my main identity was as an English teacher, not as a Black or a BAME or ethnic minority English teacher. And today I feel a lot of pressure coming precisely to remake that identity as a ethnic minority English teacher. So what is my question? So yeah, is it wrong to give up? Is it wrong to ask people to temporarily give up their identity for a bigger cause?
So people have a lot of different identities, and of course they are contextual, and their sayers is contextual. So in some context, my identity as a dad is the most important identity. In other contexts, my identity as a professor is the most important identity, and so on. But there are some identities, and this itself is very contextual because it's to do with the nature of present society, our inherited legacies, both of unity and of disunity. But there are some identities that become so important to some people that they're with them all the time. Woman is an identity that for a lot of people in this country is an identity that is with them all the time. I hear my colleagues who are, professors, academics and so on, say all the time, I am a female. I'm a female academic. Sometimes I'm a Black female academic. Sometimes it could be qualified in some other way. But their sense that their social location as a woman is very important, and that they have to sometimes struggle to make sure that that is appreciated and valued, is very important to them. Now, in other contexts or over a period of time, that may shift. They may feel, oh, well, look, everyone knows I'm a woman. I don't need to wear a badge saying I'm a woman. But the identity that I was most concerned with, or the context I was most concerned with, was our sense of being a common body of citizens, which perhaps is my alternative way of saying what you were saying when you say we are a demos. And I think that as citizens, we do have identities that we shouldn't have to give up. We shouldn't put our identities, press our identities at the expense of our commonalities. I certainly think we have to emphasize commonalities and difference. We can't just be different. That's not even kind of logical, because commonness and difference are related terms. If you talk about one, you have to say different to what and so on. So then you'll find elements of commonality as well. So basically, I'm opposing the idea of a abstract citizenship, because in practice, an abstract, what we might call a universal based citizenship, always has certain cultural features, certain social features, certain inequalities to do with class, for instance. But one of the things that it has is the sense of, oh, these are the people, this is the culture that is central, and others are marginal. And unless they join this, they can't, they don't really belong here. We don't really accept them as citizens in the full sense of the term. We just accept them as, well, they're here, and we have to recognize their legal presence and so on, which obviously is not how citizens should relate to each other. It's not the kind of solidarity of citizenship. So I do think that for many Muslims, their Muslim identity, many Black people, their Black identity is something that they don't want to see erased in the public space, because the public space is already too dominated by other identities and, our inherited culture, which works to marginalize them or to inferiorize them. And so to stand up for their identity is standing up for equality, but at the same time is changing the mix, is changing the composition of what our common culture is.
Tariq, could I ask you, who or what do you think is erasing anybody's ethnic identity? As far as I can see, I can't really see much evidence. I don't know quite what you mean, but who or what is erasing or calling on people to erase their ethnic identity?
Well, actually, in various kinds of circumstances, you find that some things, when people say, we're going to talk about British history or British literature or British music, they'll have certain things in mind and not other things. They'll make a judgment about what they think is British. Now, luckily, this has been shifting in our lifetimes, and it's been shifting because there's a struggle by people who've been excluded to be included, and that's why it's shifted. It hasn't shifted in the way that the weather changes, just all by itself. So that's what I mean by erasing, or the opposite, getting included, or marginalized, which is less than erasure, but of course it's in that direction. So when people talk about what it is to be British now, they don't assume that you have to be white to be British. They don't assume you have to be Christian. They don't assume you have to be secular, and so on. So all these open up the space for people who are not white, not Christian, not secular, to also say in what way they too are British. Because, of course, our inherited Christianity and the contemporary aspects of Christianity color our common life, color our society, and rightly so. I'm not saying it shouldn't, but it shouldn't monopolize it, and that's why we need to include things that, till the very recent past, were excluded and which we're still struggling to get proper inclusion for.
Yeah, I think I think the kind of acceptance you're talking about, you see, I think I think that's already been achieved largely, right? Most people do not think you have to be white to be British or Christian to be British. It's like that battle has been won in a similar way that Stonewall 20, 30 years ago wanted to fight for the right for homosexuals to have equal rights to marriage, etc. That has been won. And now I think what's happened, you still have these organizations that maybe were formed in one set of circumstances continuing to exist, and they're having to find different raison d'etres. And for me, I think just as in Stonewall, they've then moved on to the trans identity question. A lot of the race, in the race sphere, a lot of people have gone on from kind of the kind of social, political, economic rights that have been largely won through the various acts that have been passed, but not just from on high. They've been through struggles of solidarity on the grassroots level as well. You've had that, and they're now. This is what I was talking about at the beginning. It's entering the terrain of culture. So the battles are about, what do you teach in the classroom? What is, I don't see anything wrong. I mean, we live in Britain, right? As a de facto fact, the majority of people here are white. I think it is really deeply problematic that we're having our legal system, for example, is being restructured around the premise that to be a majority is somehow to be a threat to the minority just by the fact of being a majority. This is deeply corrosive. I mean, you look at the facts, we know that the largest, you look at the EVAC entries, for example, in school entries for GCSEs. In 2024, 34% of pupils were white, but 47% were black. So it's not the case that the minorities are always, and those statistics proportionally are reflected in achievements as well, in outcomes. Time and time again, statistical surveys show that geography and sex are far bigger determinants in social science studies than ethnicity.
So I've done quite a lot of work on this, Alka. In fact,
I know you have. I've looked at it.
Yeah, I was one of the first researchers, one of the first social scientists to say that ethnic minorities, at least certain groups at a certain time, it didn't all happen straight away. It took time. So people like Indians, as it were, led the way, but other minorities were all moving in the same direction. If you like, it was like a conveyor belt moving in the same direction. was one of the first to say that ethnic minorities are doing well in British schools and entry to British universities, when it was an anti-racist orthodoxy, even beyond anti-racism. Vice chancellors were saying it, the BBC was saying it, that ethnic minorities are disadvantaged, they are not sufficiently qualified, and so on. I say no, that's not the case. Look at the trends over time. So on that, you're pushing on an open door. I've got no argument in recognizing that ethnic minorities are achieving. You said that gender is a bigger determinant in geography. Well, geography can be. I certainly agree with that. And it's actually one of the reasons that London is now doing so well in terms of its examinations results, is because it's got such a high proportion of ethnic minorities. But gender, actually, we found in the studies that we did, when you do multivariate analysis and so on, when you can control for various variables, that in terms of entry, gender was having no effect, i.e. there was no discrimination in favor of men or in women. What is true, of course, just like ethnic minorities, women have been succeeding educationally in a way it isn't just about catching up, but which is about overtaking and continuing to overtake the other group. Boys in one case, majority white in the other case. So, I don't think we have a disagreement about that. But let's think about school curriculum. So we all have a common history just because we're British, even if some of us say, oh, my ancestors have been here on this island for 5 or 6 generations. Other people's have only been here for 1 or 2 generations. So we all have to have a history about how this country was formed and how we came to be the mix that we are. So my family is from, Pakistan and India. And in some ways, we ran that place, or parts of that place, till the British came and they took over. So we became part of British history when the British came and started ruling and exploiting India. So I need to know, and my children and grandchildren need to know that history of how we became British. So I don't think including that is in some ways, how can I put it, going against standards of pedagogy and of, the integrity of curricula. I think that to not include those things would be a kind of ethnic erasure. Probably, I suspect, but I could be wrong, I think the main difference between us is that I think that full citizenship, and by full citizenship, I mean someone who can have a sense of belonging to their national citizenship. It's not easily achieved, and we don't all achieve it to a full degree, but it's what our aspiration should be, what our theoretical goals and ideals should point towards. I think that is a identity-rich citizenship rather than a difference-blind citizenship. I think that's probably the main difference between us.
Sorry, Alka. Just was to move on from this bit. And for
I've got so much to say.
I know. I'm sure there'll be another opportunity, of course, to bring your points up. But I just wanted to give Tariq the opportunity just to ask you the second question. Did you have one for Alka?
So most of what I have here is more in terms of things I want to qualify rather than can turn easily into a question. I wonder if you'll agree with me, Alka, that a lot of what is happening in the issues that we're talking about has been historically anticipated in relation to issues about class, say 50, 75, 100 years ago. Because when working class people began to organize, when they began to get the vote, for instance, and organize, but organize in the workplace as well as politically, they did argue that the polity of their time did not reflect their interests and that their interests needed to be accommodated. And obviously some people resisted that at the time. And one of the ways that some intellectuals resisted it is that they said, no, politics is not about pushing your interests, anyone's interests, not just working class interests. It's not about pushing particular interests. It's about the common good. Politicians should think about what is good for the country, not just what's good for a subgroup of people, whether that subgroup is their class, their gender, their constituency, whatever. Would you agree with me that in a way that argument, which came to a kind of compromise where we now accept that people do reflect their class interests in politics, but we also think that politics should aim for higher forms of equality and justice, that argument is now being fought in relation to ethnic, religious, and racial minority groups in the way that it was previously fought in relation to class and then gender?
No, I don't agree with that. In fact, I think the opposite. I think the current kinds of struggles, I can see why you would think that they because the language has a certain element of continuity about it. But I think the main difference is when you're talking about class struggles, you are talking which is the biggest majority in any nation? It's the working class, right? They are de facto the majority of people. And I think today's identitarian, I would call them, struggles, actually obfuscate and hide the real, structural problems that are there, but they're not the structural problems that the identitarians say it is. The structural problems they say that exist of racism in our workplace, for example, you scratch the surface and they're not to do with racism very much at all. They're to do with 0-hour contracts, outsourcing, agency work, kind of whole set of new work practices since the financial crash in 2008 and the kind of macro level changes that people up here on economics and IR discuss, but it's kind of like the thinking isn't rolled down, fleshed out and looked across. So, you're seeing things being presented as racial problems that actually are really more to do with class problems, actually, in an old-fashioned sense. So in that sense, it's not a continuation. If you like, the erasure of class.
Okay, so we now do have a real disagreement, because I do think that issues about identity can't be reduced to issues about class or economic structure or economic distribution. I think those issues are important, of course, and they connect, like everything connects in one way or another. They connect with issues of identity, but for me, it's very important that we understand that they can't be reduced to those questions. So those people who are happy for what one might call class particularities to be pressed in the political system, but aren't happy for identitarian particularities to be pressed, I think they're either just being inconsistent, or they're clearly stating, as you did, a priority about what the real issues are. And so that is a disagreement, because multiculturalists say that the real issues are about how people are treated in terms of their identities, like racism, like the opposite of racism, respect for someone's difference, respect for how they understand themselves, rather than you trying to shape their identity and telling them what they are. When I was a young man, people, anti-racists, kept telling me that I was black when I said, no, I'm not. And they kept telling me that the most important issues were about class when I said, no, they're not. So I don't like to be told by other people what are the most important issues and what I am. And in a way, that's informed all my intellectual and academic work, because I've been fighting against those people who want to box me in to their own political categories when I want to say no. I want to reach out. I want to be British. I want to be Asian. I want to be Muslim. Of course, I want to be a professor and a Bristolian and so on. And I want all these things to be part of the public space so that they can be shared, they can be understood, they can be respected. And I don't want people keep telling me, but the big issues are all to do with economics and class.
No, that's not what I'm saying, Tariq. Sorry, I think it's a popular. And it's a fault of the left to assume that when you talk about class, you're talking about economic in a very deterministic way. For me, class, I've always been of a particular strand of the left that has seen class as far more in a relational sense. And by the way, it's also included minorities. You talked about the Indians and doing well, but the Bengalis haven't done that well, right?
They are now, actually.
They are now,
if you look at the latest, that's why I said it was like a conveyor belt. Not all minorities, because partly not all minorities arrived on the same day in Britain either. But if you look at it, it's a similar trend across minorities.
But that's good. So you see, when you say you don't want to be trapped or be told what your identity is, that is precisely what I think identity politics is doing. It's continually telling us that we are important because it's such a sort of fixed idea of identity. You're Indian or you're Asian or you're African or you're West African or you're Jamaican. Of course you are. And you can, be proud of those things, or you may not be proud of those, or you might just feel indifferent to them. I can't see anything that's stopping that. I don't need.
I hold to the view about fixed identities. So if you recall, right at the very beginning, I talked about how people's sense of identities can change over time and that they should be able to change as they want, at the pace that they want, in the combinations that they want. So it's not about fixed identities. So, for instance, in some ways, what it is to be a British Indian today is very different to what it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, we just had an Indian Prime Minister, a British Indian Prime Minister. So, of course, it's radically different to when people thought, Indians were about Sikhs working in the foundries and other people owning corner shops. So, yes, of course, people's identities will change, partly to do with economic circumstances, partly to do with their relationship to other groups of people, and partly how they come to make being British something of their own. So in all kinds of ways, it will be changed. I think if you want a parallel to what I'm saying, it's a bit like, and again, I remember this from my younger days, when in the 1960s and 70s, some feminists, left-wing feminists, socialist feminists and so on, started articulating their point of view, exploring and developing their point of view. The first wave of that was met by a kind of older male socialists in the trade unions, but also among some intellectual socialists. Well, that's all very well, and we'll attend to those matters about gender inequality after the revolution. I.e., your issues are secondary. I'll tell you what the most important issues are. So that's really the kind of parallel.
No, I remember those days. They were not that dissimilar in age to that, but I would say that the situation is very different today. We're no longer facing those problems. The problems are very different. Now I would argue that it's actually the majority who are actually been disintegrated, who need to be reintegrated, right? And that majority is de facto mainly white, but not exclusively. It includes, it's going to be majority heterosexual, but not exclusively, right? It's the different lines, I think, emerging here that I think the old traditional discourse of race and anti-racism is inadequate to capture and to explore fully. I'm totally with you on the fluidity of identity to to a point. On the sex gender thing, I'd say you can't really unidentify your sex, gender maybe, but not sex. But I think that the point is that's precisely what you see happening today. You see, there's a huge cultural effort to, even in schools, at primary schools, to make children see race. And I have never felt more aware of my race. I mean, I grew up in the 60s in Britain, faced a certain amount of old style racism. But then generally during the 80s, 90s, as I reached adulthood, went into my work, professions, wrote, etc., I was Alka, and I was writer of this. I was somebody who was interested in that. I was invited to conferences because I'd written this, which had nothing to do with my race. And now I find myself in a culture that is constantly reflecting back. You are an ethnic minority. Be proud of it. Well, I don't want to be proud of it. It just is part of me. I don't want to be proud of something I've had no part in shaping or any input in. I have
we do shape these things in the way that I'm proud to be British, but it's a sheer accident of life that my parents brought me here. I was born in Pakistan, but they brought me here at a very young age. And
yes, but being British,
I could remain in Pakistan, and I'd be a very different person. I'd probably be very proud to be what I would have been then. So I think people can be proud of things they haven't fully made themselves. We all start with something. We don't, we're born with various features. We don't choose our parents, for instance. So yeah, I think fate and will, what we shape with our choices and decisions, I think these intersect in quite complex ways. And when we talk about pride and when we talk about solidarity, both these things come together. So it's not a matter of I can only be proud of my book because I wrote it, but I can't be proud because I'm a British Pakistani, because that's just an accident of fate.
No, well, look, Tariq, when you launched the space missile, I felt really proud, right? I was, yay, go India. But that really, when I thought about it, and I was puzzled by my reaction because of it wasn't a problem for me. I was just puzzled by it. But it was because of the family, an actual real family connection and history, not the Indianness per se, if you see what I mean. And just like you just said, if you were Pakistani or Ghanaian and you had that family connection, you'd feel this probably similar too. But
I think Ada is trying to tell you something.
Sorry, Ada.
Very. No, it's great. Very good. Great discussion so far. I just wanted to ask a question of each of you, if